Hi, everybody. We're back and we are here to talk about universal project management in the digital age. Hi, everybody. We are back again with Sam Drauschak for another discussion. Today, we're going to talk about universal project management in the digital age. Sam is a co-founder of Truvle, which is a company that offers consulting knowledge through software solutions. Sam, thanks for coming back for another very interesting and educational discussion. We appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here.
So let's dive right into this. So, we're living in this age of globalization and dial tone perfect technology. And in the year and now in the time period following COVID, we've got increasingly, we have organizations that are working in virtual environments and in geographically dispersed organizations. This seems to be the way things are going forward now. It's the status quo. And as a result of that, everything is naturally shifting to agile software projects that have faster turnaround times. These things seem to be linked. Before we get into a discussion of this and the various dimensions about this, what you have termed universal project management in a digital age, that was your phrase. Could you help us define what you mean by agile? Because I know when there's a lot of different people at different levels in organizations, and they use agile differently. They use it in a loose way. They use it in a strict way. What do we mean when we talk about agile, and what are the different contexts within which agile can have different meanings?
Sure. Yeah, and I'll also talk about universal project management when I answer your question about agile too, because I do think this is super important and will be a great foundation for the conversation. When I talk about universal project management, I don't want that to be conflated right off the bat with Agile. Agile is a set of principles, and we'll talk about that. And then you have principles that inform project management methodologies. So when I'm talking about a universal project management methodology, we're talking about a method that it would be the same across any context, any set of principles you use, any company culture. So what are the real basic building blocks of what project management should be and how to execute it successfully? So that's that particular piece. And then when we talk about Agile, which is the favorite, it's the project management methodology du jour, but it's not actually a methodology. Agile is it's a manifesto, it's a set of principles, and it really is a set of principles that guides how a new project management method should be constructed. And when I say new, it's not as much new anymore. I'm referring to new compared to when it was mostly, waterfall and more traditional project management methodologies. So Agile, when we're referring to it in this conversation, if we refer to it colloquially or casually, we're probably referring to an Agile methodology like Scrum, which is prescriptive for how a project should be run. But then if we want to talk about it at the principle level, then we'll say Agile Principles. I think that would be a good way to do it in this conversation. And I'm happy to define both, but I'll pause there. Does that help set the stage?
Yeah. So why don't you help summarize real quickly what the principles are, just for the benefit of our audience?
Sure. So the Agile principles, there's 4 of them, and that really is what comprises Agile. And I have the formal definition here, so I'll just kind of read it out. It's individuals and interactions over processes and tools. That's one principle. It's working software over comprehensive documentation. And then there's customer collaboration over contract negotiation, and responding to change over following a plan. Those are the 4 Agile principles. And, at a high level, if you think through what I just said, Agile, when it hit the scene, these principles are really to encourage faster iterations of workable product, making sure you're having conversations with the right people, and that you have a more collaborative spirit with the client throughout the entirety. And you'll see how those principles translate into a number of methodologies, but those are the 4 Agile principles.
So what's the connection that you made between the Agile philosophy, the Agile principles, the Agile way of doing things, and the trend towards increasingly distributed virtual working environments? What's the link between these 2 things?
So Agile, even before the pandemic and before this trend towards geographically dispersed workforces that you're talking about, the waterfall approach, which was heavier planning and more of a long project tail to get a workable product, was already getting pressure. And Agile was really born in that space to have, let's say, quicker iterations, The whole group, the sponsor, the product owner, the client could be looking at what was being built and give feedback more often. And it makes sense. It's essentially, if you create channels for more feedback, then the product will more likely become something that we want to use. And business generally has been getting faster and wanting, you can't take 2 years before the client sees something and they'll still accept it. So that was already happening. Now, to answer your question directly about why now is it even more relevant than it was, let's say 10 years ago, because everyone is becoming geographically dispersed, because we're all working on digital solutions and we need more digital solutions, the pressure to be quicker, more iterative, and more agile as it's used is even more pressing now than it's ever been before, because the ability to have everyone co-located, to manage giant project teams that span across multiple dimensions of these huge sprawling efforts is really less and less tenable in a virtual environment, where you need stronger structures and you need more flexible structures and you need people that are able to work, teams form and disband very quickly. So a lot of what was afforded to us with larger, longer tail initiatives in the physical co-located environment is just no longer even accessible anymore, which is just pushing this trend of more agile demand further and further.
So is it fair to say that the waterfall, I mean, outside of, say, aerospace, and huge, like, complex defense projects, is it fair to say that the waterfall model is effectively dead within corporate America? Do you see clients, these days still using the waterfall model in these distributed virtual environments?
I don't. And it almost seems intense to say, but exactly as you pointed out, besides the stronger, heavier, maybe very capital intensive industries with longer construction type projects, waterfall to me is basically dead. I mean, you don't see it anywhere. The only place you see it, especially when we're talking about your basic corporate setting where we're doing software work, is when people who have been trained for 3 or 4 decades on it just keep resurfacing it involuntarily. And it ends up being hybridized based on company culture and the various methods that are out there. But no, I don't see anyone who's championing a waterfall methodology for any projects across any part of the corporate arena that myself or my colleagues have experienced, at least in the last probably 5-10 years.
So what do you mean when you're saying that when you talk about a universal project management being a methodology that it's the same across all cultures? Are you suggesting that Agile is that universal project management methodology? Is that what you're suggesting, or am I missing the intent of that premise?
So I'm actually suggesting, I'm not making that suggestion directly. I don't think it's something you're missing. I think Agile is the closest thing in terms of the Agile principles that's giving a guideline where you could have a universal methodology that sits under it. But actually, to the contrary, I think a universal project management methodology in best practice, it would involve some aspects of Agile. It would involve some aspects of the traditional waterfall typical what we associate with waterfall approach, with heavier project charters and requirements management and documentation. I think when I talk about universal project management, it's really divorced from methodology, because a lot of the methodology, if we say Agile or we say waterfall, in people's minds, it associates with a number of tools, with a number of steps or sequences. But when I talk about universal project management, which I think is where we need to have the conversation for this new heavier digitized age and faster demand type market context, is really talking about what are the true fundamentals, agnostic of method, that you need to keep a project together. Do you need sponsorship? Do you need a certain level of requirements management? Do you need a certain amount of team mix? What are the elements that, regardless of whether you're using waterfall, Agile, hybrid, something new, something even older, what are the pure building blocks that one would consider universal to manage a project? And that's what I'm referring to.
I suppose you put a lot of thought into this. Can you share with us what you feel that formula is?
So I don't know if I could share it with you in a few words, but I actually started to tease it just in the last description I gave. I think when you talk about running a project, I think first separating it from operations and understanding the difference between what is a project versus what is your operating environment. How do you identify the resources that are taking place in each, and how do you essentially articulate a container that says this is project work compared to this is our day-to-day work? So that would be an example of a step in the formula, let's say, of a universal project management context, because that is, and let's talk about that as step one, whatever your organization is in whatever industry, the ability to differentiate, okay, now I have resources that are going from their day-to-day to embark on a project. And that means you have to have a very clear definition of what is a project. How do you allocate resources toward a project? How do you actually put the boundaries around that work? How do you scope it? So that's sort of a first step. And then beyond that, there's always going to be something like a project charter. But the question is what elements? There's always going to be something about managing requirements. But how does one do that? So that's where, whether you're agile or something else, those are the fundamental steps. And I definitely could list them, but it could end up turning into a discursive academic topic. So maybe we let me pause there before you get me really excited and I just go ahead and give away the whole thing.
No, I understand. I understand. I appreciate that. Has this concept though, has it been codified anywhere that you know of?
No, it hasn't. And that's why I think it's such a fascinating topic, because when people talk about project management, they often are talking about the method. And that's where a lot of conversations either have contention or they have trouble. When you go into organizations that are under duress in terms of how they're managing their portfolios or managing their programs, a lot of people spend a lot of time saying, we're an agile organization. We're not, we're a hybrid organization. What method are we using? What tools and templates are we using? And really what I'm trying to bring to light in this conversation, and to your point, has a universal academic foundation been codified? Not really divorced from the different methodologies, because if you think about it, everyone is learning project management through the lens of somebody's methodology. You're either learning it through the PMI, you're learning it through, the Scrum or an Agile Institute or an Agile institution, or you're learning it on the fly. And typically, one is not really in a position, there's not a lot of organizations out there saying, come to our class and we'll teach you the universals of project management that you could then go and adapt to any particular person's methodology or context. So as far as I've seen, it's not been codified, but I think it's going to be increasingly important if you think about, okay, I may have to go today from an agile project over to a hybrid project, or I'm moving from an agile company to maybe a less progressive or even a more progressive company. And if all of your project management knowledge is just tied to method, it's also going to slow you down when you think about this increasingly fast-paced, increasingly digitized world, which is, okay, I've learned how to do project management one way. How do I adapt the fundamentals in different contexts? And I think that's a lot of why this conversation we're having is so critical to practitioners going into the market today.
Do you think that given that there are many vested interests in a lot of the existing methodologies, and do you feel that this concept would meet with some resistance because it's sort of suggesting just a different approach as opposed to the traditional, getting certified, PMBOK, all of that sort of thing, which so many people go down. Do you feel like there's going to be some resistance to this, and how would you deal with that within the project management community?
Absolutely. I think there will be resistance for sure. I mean, it's kind of like when the first free online classes came out and people asked, well, do you think there'll be resistance from four-year universities or institutions? Or when people started publishing their code online and creating an open source culture, there was a lot of companies who were concerned, and the community that was still vested in IP protection and protecting their intellectual property generally was definitely resistant. I think it's another sign of us all going into a new age where the only way to keep up with demand is to collaborate and become a network. And I think project management professionals, the first step is really knowing what you're buying and knowing what you know versus what you don't know. And that's an important first step. Do I think the PMI and do I think the people who are making millions of dollars a year on certification courses and on having a boundaries to these knowledges that they can monetize? Absolutely, they'd be resistant to an open source idea that, hey, we need to teach people fundamentals of project management, and we need to let people know that there's a flexible understanding here and start to have a conversation about what is the right way to think about project management, divorced of these methods or certifications. So, but it's not going to help anyone who's making money on it today. So I think there's always going to be a natural push and pull. I don't think it's really unrealistic to think that they would want to just throw their entire business model in the trash and make everything free. But I do think in a lot of domains, which is why I kind of brought up some of those examples around education and code libraries, open sourcing is the way of the future, and people are going to have to sell knowledge in different ways than they conceived before. And I think if you really want to be competitive, you want to be on the edge of your game, learning and sharing and then evolving that body of knowledge with the community in an open way is probably going to be the approach we're going to see to a lot of things in this generation.
I want to speak a little bit more specifically. I want to get back into the subject of Agile in terms of the, let's say when you're, forming and managing project teams, for instance. What would you say that the implications of Agile are for forming and managing project teams? I mean, one of the premises that you've made is that in this increasingly global and totally interconnected environment, where we're all distributed and working remotely, we're going to have to be expected to come together quickly, break apart quickly, come together quickly with new people, form new teams, get new things done, break apart, and the speed of that is accelerating. So what exactly is the role of Agile in that process of forming and managing project teams?
Sure. So Agile, and I'm referring now to the Scrum method of executing Agile, it really took hold in the market where the team was supposed to be smaller and simpler, where you have your development resources for Agile software projects, and you have your product owner, and then you have your Scrum Master, who's essentially the equivalent of a project manager. And a lot of organizations try to take that to heart, where, okay, it was easier, to your point of how do we make and break teams smaller and faster, and that was supposed to make it more manageable. But again, in talking and tying back in, okay, what is the universal aspects? Well, which of those roles did requirements management? Which of those roles was accountable for driving project delivery? Which of those roles was actually saying the voice of the customer or owning the actual business requirements? So there's a number of things there was left question marks. And then every person who said, okay, I'm reading Scrum and I'm trying to adapt it to my organization, and it ends up being different in every case because there's not a strong teaching of, well, our intention behind the method is to have all of these functions grouped together. So whether you're using Agile again, or you're using something else, I think the key to making, breaking, and managing small teams that are going to especially coordinate over a virtual environment is really being clear on the functions you need to make a project successful. And from my perspective, and here's my professional opinion on it, you definitely need a clear line to the requirements. You need somebody whose skill set is to document and manage the requirements and own them, like a traditional business analyst who actually doesn't have a role in Agile. And then you need somebody to make sure that they're being tested and validated against those same requirements on the back end when you're making software solutions. And if you can make sure those functions are essentially covered, well, and you'd also want a pure project management function to drive schedule and coordinate and things like that. So I'm not being exhaustive. But the point is, if you think about it functionally, whether you have an Agile team or you have whatever team, or you're just gathering up whoever's in the office who can help at a given time, depending on the formality of your environment, if you focus on the functions and you can get those together in whatever way they come, then you can make a good attempt at having a project execution function. The best Agile team, if it's missing some of those critical functions, even if you have the roles correct, they're going to struggle. And we see that a lot out there in the environment. So especially as we move faster and we move virtually, you as a manager, you as sort of a business leader have to know, if I'm creating a virtual team, do I have the right functions in play, regardless of role? So I hope that wasn't too roundabout.
No, not at all. Not at all. I mean, what would you say the state of awareness is and the preparedness of organizations who are faced with these challenges on a daily basis in your experience as a consultant?
Because my experience is still fairly low. And that's why I think this is such a timely topic. I think especially after we went out of the office, it's become even harder for people to understand what you and I are talking about right now, which is I don't have a bunch of people who are named product owner across, Zoom. I don't have a number of people who are named project manager or named Scrum Master, or sometimes definitely people are rolled project manager, but project manager with what experience, with what functional skills. And I think, again, managers are poorly equipped to assess capability. Let me put it that way. I think it's one of the strongest opportunities for most organizations today, which is let's put our role titles aside. Let's put our departments aside. Let's put that, hey, this is Gary that sits on the second floor aside. You need to know, going into a virtual environment, what functions you need to be successful to enable your process, let's say your project process or even your operations process. And then you need to know how to be able to see those capabilities in a virtual organization. And that could be through talking people and assessing them directly. It could be having org charts that list functions and capabilities more transparently. But that's one of the biggest struggles. Unless you know a person and know what they're capable of and how they might match up for what you need, a lot of people are not prepared to form project teams quickly in digital organizations, because how would you know if you're not used to having that level of transparency around capabilities and also being able to map your projects that way?
What about tools? I mean, how quickly is the landscape for tools and templates and systems out there shifting? How difficult is it to keep up with all of that? And are there any real basics that everybody needs to sort of be using in their bag of tricks?
Yeah, I think it's evolving very quickly. So anyone who's out there right now looking for digital tools to do project management, you're actually inundated with way too many options. There's hundreds, if not thousands, of really fantastic tools that help with project management digitally, that help with ticketing, that help with managing teams, scheduling, organizing. The issue that everyone's having is mapping their process accurately to those tools, because there's no vendor organization typically that will tell you how to configure them for success. So a lot of people in the market right now, there's tons of really highly regarded project management tools and SaaS platforms out there to do this kind of work. But time and time again, we see organizations that they don't have the skills internally to configure it correctly, and it quickly becomes unusable. So I would say, just as a first answer at a very high level, there's a ton of tools out there. And it's not even really about picking. You want to pick the right one based on your size, your tolerance for costs, and the structure that the tool offers. But really what you need to know going into it is deriving the value out of these tools is really understanding what we're talking about here, which is what type of projects are you running? What type of team build do you need to be successful in your space? And how do you configure a system to match that? Because if you think buying a system is going to teach you how to do project management in the digital space, that's where a lot of people, they think they're going to buy the magic bullet. You got to still know the universal foundation. You still have to know the method you're using. You still have to know the functions and the capabilities you need to succeed. The tool is just going to facilitate that over the virtual environment.
You know, I speak a lot to project management organizations about digital transformation and about all the new, technological change that's coming down, and how they have to become generalists and they have to know a little bit about a lot of things in order to kind of just stay aware of what's going on, and to maintain mental models of how the world is shifting. It would be, as I speak to these people, could you, and knowing that like what you say is going to go to me and then to them in some way, what would you say the skills and capabilities are currently, or should be, for the successful project managers in this increasingly digital environment that we're living in? What sort of advice would you have for them? How would you describe their critical, skill set, not just in terms of technical, but perhaps even, emotional and psychological, the whole package? What is it that you would sort of, how would you characterize the most successful project managers in this environment?
Sure. A lot of what I would categorize now as necessary is having a good beat on the conversation we're having. If somebody asks you, what project management methodology are you using, can you clearly articulate what it is and what that actually means? I think a lot of project managers let me phrase it this way, because that's such an expansive topic. I would love to define at nuance. Okay, here's the perfect project management profile, in my opinion. But I want to start by saying, in a less digital context, let's take this back maybe 2 decades ago. A successful project manager could be one that, if they were able to broker a project charter in front of them, the majority of their job was making friends around the project team, making sure they could call people, ask for stuff when they needed it, make sure they were collecting when things were getting done and when, and being able to report that up to management, and just driving accountability. I would say a successful project manager was more heavy on the soft skills in this context that I'm talking about, the ability to interface with people, get them motivated, see where people were struggling, and really try to work from a soft skills perspective to make sure the project had what it needed and people were communicating and meeting its goals. I would say that has dramatically changed in the environment that we're talking about with the tools we're talking about. And I think this is really the point you're driving, Michael, which is, where was the training that addressed this? In the current day, what I would say is a good project manager needs less soft skills than they did back then, because there's no one to talk to. There's no office. There's no water cooler. There's no just like catching people talking about the project and sort of between different things. You have to, number one, be comfortable with these tools that we were just referencing in abstract. So every organization that's virtual or going virtual is going to have some project management tool. You could even say that's Excel. You could say that it's one of these new SaaS things. But being able to translate how the team is going to organize themselves digitally and configure a tool to help facilitate that conversation is probably the number one skill set that I see missing from project managers that would take from a B player getting up to an A player. Because now if you as a project manager think somebody else is going to come and configure your system to work on your project, there's usually a gap there. And that's where a lot of projects are starting to really struggle virtually. And then the second thing is really just being tight on these fundamentals, which is when everyone's apart, how are you going to make sure you're keeping people accountable and keeping good records, but not having to spend hundreds of hours a month just on record keeping and digital data cleanup and things like that. So in short, I mean, there's a lot of different ways that that question could go, but I do want to highlight that you need to have more of the hard skills. You need to have some technology skills. You need to have some process awareness. And I think it's really, really important for project managers now to have a really technical and academic understanding of what is project management and what are they there to do. Because I see a lot of people struggling in this environment, and that could go a lot of different ways. But let me stop there.
No, I'm a little bit disheartened by this message because when I communicate to project managers, I always like to give them an example of the fact that automation and artificial intelligence might be able to exceed us technically, but that we'll always have a comparative advantage in terms of emotional intelligence, the ability to be influencers, the ability to develop rapport with people, and that so much of what's going on in project management is on that soft side, is on that emotional intelligence side, and that gives us an area of comparative advantage relative to the technology. And in fact, this is a total upside. You're turning this message around totally upside down, which is, I'm going to have to sort of think about this for a while. But don't you think if we're going back to the technology as the tools, for instance, for one thing, as a critical success factor in a world that is totally remote, where people don't have the ability to sort of assert soft power over these projects, what's project management going to look like in 10 years or even 15 years when when AI and automation continues its inexorable exponential acceleration? Is it possible that project managers will be taken out of the equation? The one thing that has always seemed to protect them is that they do have that ability to sort of assert soft skills and they have the emotional IQ. So I'm a little bit worried about what the prognosis is for the long term, and I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that. I understand it's just a prediction. Everybody's entitled to their predictions, but I mean you're a very knowledgeable person, so I'm curious what you think about the prognosis 10, 15 years out. Well,
to maybe allay your fears a little bit, I actually think I'm going to come back and meet you closer than you think, beyond halfway, because it's not that there's a lack of soft skills. And I actually, despite what you may have just implied, I think project management is getting more complicated and it's going to be more needed with the increasing automation. And I'll explain why. I think what project managers used to do when we talk about soft skills, and I just gave this narrative about people were engaging that charisma passively in a co-located environment to kind of navigate the nuance of the project and the interpersonal dynamics. I think that same level of charisma and soft skills, it's not being deployed directly, but the interactions that it created have to be now translated to a digital environment. And that's why I think it's even more important for project managers to have this understanding of how to configure technology, how to use tools, because whereas, like, say 5 years ago, a project manager who knew that critical conversations had to happen at this pace between these functions, they have to apply that charisma into a software solution to make sure that those same interactions can happen, but in a digital space. And that actually takes less intuition and more conscious processing of what is that art? What is that soft skill? What is it actually bringing together? Why has that traditionally been such an important interaction? So in that way, it's really talking about the skill that they're missing in this new world is not that soft skill. It's the ability to translate the value of those soft skills and how they were employed before into digital forums, into project management tools. And I think that, like I said, is going to make project management even more critical. So as automation and robotics and different solutions come that help people connect over long distances, transfer documentation and data much more quickly and effectively, things are moving faster, and the ability to stay connected and coordinated is even more pressing. So the project manager's job is not to, I don't think it's going away. I actually think it's becoming more critical and it's becoming more necessary, but it itself is evolving. You're not going to be able to rely on just a loose idea of what needs to be done and your natural soft skills to tie that together. You're going to have to really think about the mechanics of what collaboration and what communication bring to an efficient project. And then how do I translate that process or that set of processes into a digital environment? And to me, I think it's a good outlook for project management. I think it's going to be more complicated. It might not be the same people that are attracted to the role because the capabilities are changing. But no, I do not mean to imply that project management is going away. I think it will be very prominent, especially because also just one more comment on that, projects are happening in greater frequency and faster. A good project manager that can manage more projects is going to manage more projects in a year in 2022 than they did, in 2012, because they're just happening so much more. So, I mean, there's so much opportunity here, but you're not going to be able to rest on your laurels if you're a project manager.
Sam, I could talk all day. You always have so much interesting perspectives, but we're going to have to sort of save some of this energy for a future podcast. Don't want to cover all the territory at one time. So thank you. You've given us a lot to think about, a lot of very fresh insights. We again hope we can have you back to talk about this again. I hope you enjoyed today's discussion, and thank you for your time.
Thanks a lot, Michael. I always enjoy the discussion.
See you next time.